Mr. Baker, when you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. I told you in opening statement that this world had failed Demiah Appling. That wasn't an attempt to demean her. It wasn't an attempt to lessen her humanity. It wasn't in any way an attempt to minimize what happened to her. I told you that because there were a long string of failures long before the events of October 16th and 17th. I was a little girl that this world had failed. She was already running wild at that point. You heard testimony from Keith Anderson that he was so concerned about her drug use that he had cut ties with her. And that's relevant not to lessen her as a human being. Because she is a human being. I don't know if Mr. Thomas misunderstood me. That is to explain that when you start going down that path, unexpected and dangerous things happen. And that does not mean just because those things happen that they have proven that Mr. Gerhardt is the one that killed her. Somebody did kill Demiah Appling. There has never been any doubt about that. No one has ever disagreed with that. But the question you have to ask yourself is, has the state proven beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt who that was? Now let's start talking about some of the witnesses in this case. Clearly, there are a lot of individuals here who I don't think any reasonable person would leave their 14-year-old with. Amy Valentine is one of them. And she was the first person to testify in this trial. You may recall, and I'm going to remind you of this several times. I'm going to tell you right at the beginning. The testimony in this trial comes from this chair. It doesn't come from Mr. Thomas and what he says he thinks happened. And most of what you heard during the closing argument immediately before I spoke was the opinion of Mr. Thomas and did not reflect the facts that were heard from that chair. And I don't ask you to take my word for that, okay? I rely on the evidence. And I want you to look at State's Exhibit number 4. This is the text conversation between Keith Anderson and Demiah Appling in and around the time that she is leaving Amy Valentine's home at 8:30 at night, a 14-year-old on foot alone. Now think about that. All right? She goes over there the first time. Keith Anderson has lured her over there. He is telling her in States 4 that she needs to come over there. Nowhere before she goes over there is there word one about Wayne. None. The only time during this entire conversation Wayne is even mentioned is after she is on her way back and Keith says, "You should have stayed over there. Wayne was going to take you." That's it. That's the only mention of Wayne anywhere in this conversation. You know what else is nowhere in this conversation? There's no mention of a gun anywhere in this conversation. That is something that Mr. Thomas has dreamed up because there is absolutely no evidence presented at any point during this trial that puts that .22 long rifle in that car. No witness testified to that. Not in a text message, not in live testimony, not even in changed live testimony, because we heard plenty of that, didn't we? I want to talk with you a little bit about some of the folks that testified in this trial. What we had was a parade on day one of folks who all knew that they had done the wrong thing by Demiah. A pack of potheads who couldn't keep their story straight, who changed their testimony over and over again. I think the one person whose testimony you can rely on in this case, you know who it was? Nancy Meyer, the person who said that Wayne didn't show up for work that night. I think that's probably true. She had no reason to lie. The rest of these folks, let's think about Keith. You know, Mr. Thomas told you during his closing argument, why does anyone delete a conversation? Why does anybody do that? He used it to suggest that Mr. Gerhardt was tampering with the evidence. Let's think about who was the one person in this entire case who you've seen evidence of deleting conversations. Was it Mr. Gerhardt? It was not. It was Mr. Anderson. He testified that he did that. He agreed with me that now we would never know what was in those text messages that he deleted. He's the one who unsent messages to Demiah after the state is saying that she was killed. He is also the one, if you look at this text string between him and Demiah, he is the one that tells her to get out. What's he mean by that? Does he mean get out of the car so I can shoot you? Could very well. Could very well. I suggest to you that perhaps the state at this point may be a little regretful of having put him on probation in order to testify here. Because what you heard from Todd Hoyle was not that he was continuously in Welborn. That is not what you heard. There are 2 data points, and I encourage you to look at the information that's coming back with you. There are 2 data points on Keith Anderson. One of them is at 9:08, the night of the 16th, and the next one is not until 11 o'clock the next morning. So during the entire period of time, when all of this is supposed to have happened, Keith Anderson's whereabouts are unknown. There is no electronic data that will tell you where Keith Anderson was. Remember how I told you in opening statement that the state didn't have to provide a motive, but they surely have not. Have they provided a motive here? Keith Anderson had a motive. He's the only person in this case who made any threats of violence towards Demiah. Those are recorded in the conversations that have been introduced. You'll get to see those. Those are in State's Exhibit, I believe it's 32. It's a text string between him and Demiah. He's the one that lured her over here. He's the one telling her to get in the car. Nothing from Wayne about any of that stuff. That's all Keith. Every bit of it. 100%. The only motive that they can ascribe to Mr. Gerhardt also comes from Keith. And it wasn't even stable testimony. His initial testimony was that he believed that he was getting Demiah. And I'm pointing here again because this is what Keith testified to. His testimony was that he believed he was getting Demiah to come over to this residence so that Wayne and Demiah could drink and smoke together. That's what he testified to. Now, Mr. Durrett, during the direct examination, kind of pressed him on that issue, and finally, after a couple of questions, got him to agree that there might be sex involved. Then I came up on cross-examination, I asked him about that again, and Keith says he never said that, he just invited her over there to drink and smoke. No motive for Waymore Gerhardt. No motive at all for the killing of Demiah Appling on his part. Dylan, as you may recall, agreed when I asked him that he had never told the same story twice in this case. Throughout the entire case, he has never told the same story. First, he didn't know anything about it. Then somebody told him where the body was. Then, later on, it wasn't until we had a Perry Mason moment, right? I don't know if anybody remembers Perry Mason. But back in the old days, Perry Mason used to have court cases and somebody would stand up in the back and say, "It was me." And we had a bit of a Perry Mason moment when he had some testimony that was given on the stand for the first time. He'd been talked to 6 or 7 times previous to that. And he had changed his testimony to something he'd never testified to before. Oh, Wayne took me out there. What is his motivation to do that? You think it might have something to do with him trying to cast blame elsewhere and away from him, maybe get the cops off his back? Think that might be a little bit of Keith's motivation? Where'd all these kids go after this happened in the gardens back in 2022? Are any of them still living there? No. Keith's off in St. Augustine. Dylan's gone to Georgia. Max has gone to Georgia. Everybody decided that, I was involved in something that was bad. I need to flee the scene. I've got a consciousness of guilt. I'm going to move elsewhere. And you heard Keith tell you about what a dangerous place that the gardens was, that he'd seen Demiah riding around in a golf cart doing meth with one of the people there. It's not to impugn her. 14, you don't make a whole lot of decisions on your own. You make some, but not most of them. It's a product of the environment. But I tell you that because when Mr. Durrett inevitably gets up here during his rebuttal and tells you who else would have done this, there are plenty of answers out there. Plenty of them. The gardens itself are a suspect in this case. And let's not forget Alex Kuznicki. He's the one who had the residents closest to where they found Demiah's body, right? You saw the map. You can look at it again when you go in the jury room. He's the one that lives in Bell right down the road. Phone records were never pulled. DNA never run. Who knows what involvement he had? There's no location data on him. All we have is his word that he had nothing to do with it. We'll never know. We will never know because we failed to find out. Let's talk about the gun. And I'm going to go, actually, wait, no, I want to talk about one other thing that Mr. Thomas said in his closing argument that I thought was very interesting. Because remember that what he says is not testimony. You have to rely on what you hear out of the chair. And he gives this detailed account of all this social media stuff, all these text messages and all this, right up until Demiah gets in the car with somebody. Text messages don't say it's Wayne. Okay? That's not what her text messages say at all. Read them. They're right here. And then he says, let's skip ahead. Right? Because there's a big old blank spot right there in what happened. And then he fills in this narrative of what he thinks happened during the next hour. But there is zero evidence about what happened during that hour. None at all. There are a couple of location blips, and we're going to get to the electronic data last. But there is no testimony at all about what happened during that hour. Only the guesses of Mr. Thomas. Now, we've talked a lot about this gun. And I think we've all managed at this point to dramatically pull it out of the box at some point. Oh, it's where? Good. I don't have to pull it out of the box anymore. Just leave it against the wall. Not going to point it at anybody. I want to show you the gun because I want to talk a little bit about the DNA that was on this gun. I find it extremely interesting that the portions of this gun that were swabbed for DNA were the barrel, the stock, and the trigger. Demiah Appling's DNA was not anywhere on the gun, and I think that fits the state's theory of the case. So we know she wasn't any of the unknown DNA on here. But on this style of long gun, who in the world would not swab the bolt, the chamber, and this particularly, I think that you heard Miss Ritchie explain that once you've got a round chamber, I think it's called the bolt cock. You've got to pull that back in order to fire the gun. Can you imagine doing DNA testing on this gun and never swabbing that? It's a failure by FDLE. I asked Ritchie about that. She's like, oh, I'm not a DNA expert. You don't have to be a DNA expert. You might need to be a common sense expert to swab the bolt cock, but you don't need to be a DNA expert. And you got to put a fair amount of pull in that bolt cock to get it back. I'm not going to dry fire those. You got to put a little bit of effort into that bolt to operate the bolt. You saw a demonstration on Mr. Thomas about how long it took to operate that bolt and pull it back and chamber the round. Don't you think that whoever's hand that was making a whole bunch of contact all over that? Would you like to have known who chambered that round? That would have been a good piece of evidence. It's a failure. It's a failure in this case. But the one piece of evidence that we do have, is about the swabbings on this trigger guard and the trigger. You heard from Miss Hatcher that the DNA was a mixture of 3 individuals. She told you that 2 of those individuals were expected because they were the ones who owned the gun. Max Lyons and Waymore Gerhardt. It was found in their house. Despite the fact that Barsha overlooked it 3 times, it was still found. Okay? Third person has never been identified. It's probably not Garth Brooks, but we don't know who it is. Somebody from the Gardens. Mr. Thomas's argument is emblematic of the failure of this investigation. They had their man, and at some point, they just gave up on it. I don't know when that was, but they gave up. So let's talk about a little bit about that electronic data. Mr. Hoyle testified about cell phone records and about making all these plot maps and such, putting individuals at various locations at various times during the pendency of all this. This was done because the witnesses that they had in this case were unreliable, right? We heard about people that are on probation, people that have changed their stories repeatedly, people that are letting 14-year-olds sleep with each other. I don't, all of the testimony here from the non-law enforcement officers came across as being tainted. But can we rely on the law enforcement officers? Sometimes we can, but Mr. Hoyle testified when he was going through his cross-examination with Mr. Appling, first he was testifying, every single data point made it into my map. Every one of those data, I plotted it point by point as it went through. And it wasn't until we got to the crucial portion of that map, the part where the state claims is when Mr. Gerhardt was at the burial site, claims that he was burying Demiah at that point. Suddenly there's a big old gap in all those data points. There are 14 points that he admitted that hadn't been plotted on there because he had filtered them out because they didn't agree with the state's theory of the case. I suggest to you that calls into question the remainder of the data prepared by Mr. Hoyle. I am not a Duke graduate. I am not a materials engineer. I did not spend 2 years at Florida in the material science program getting a master's degree. So I can't go through those records and find every inconsistency. But what I can tell you is that he finally admitted, just after a cursory examination, to having left some of the data out. And I don't know why you would do that. I don't know why you would try and have Barsha testify. I don't know why Mr. Thomas would testify if this is a slam dunk case. That makes no sense. If you've got beyond a reasonable doubt, why do you need those things? You don't. You absolutely do not. So there is a failure in this case to preserve the evidence. You recall that Mr. Hoyle said that one of the reasons they didn't have as much electronic data as they otherwise would, you remember what it was? It was because she wasn't reported for 9 days after she went missing, and by that time all the cell phone providers had deleted much of the electronic data that you heard Lieutenant LaPresto, I can still remember him, electronic data. He says it about 30 times in the interview. Unpreserved, deleted. The next failure was a failure by Hoyle to do a good and thorough job. I think he could have probably explained, as the state is going to try and explain, why those dots bounce all over. I think I talked to everybody about how long they lived in Dixie County. If you've lived in Dixie County and have been in and around this area of Florida, you know that cell service is sometimes like, you can't get anything. I mean, that's just a fact of life here. But instead of just explaining that and saying, hey, look, this particular spot wasn't covered, he left the data out. That's insulting to you. Because he doesn't think that you understand that information. They never produced a motive. They never produced a witness that would say that Demiah Appling was killed by Mr. Gerhardt. They never produced a murder scene. Now they're going to get up here and they're going to tell you that they have this one point out in the Yellow Jacket Reservoir, that's where they think, and I stress the word think, that the murder occurred. Did you hear any testimony about them going out and looking for evidence out there? I didn't. Failed to identify the DNA on the gun. They failed to prove that the gun is tied to the murder. Richie said it shared class characteristics. Then, when I talked to her in cross-examination, she admitted that the class characteristic it primarily shared was that it had 6 of the, I think she called them ridges, in the rifling of the gun. She said there were 6. And she admits that that number, 6, is the most common for 22 long barrel guns. 22 is a very common kind of gun, period. That's a gun that a lot of people have owned, shot. Probably some of you own 22s. And my point is that all we know is that there was a 22 long rifle at that residence, and we know that a 22 bullet was what killed Demiah. We don't know what 22. We don't know what 22. I think that they have done a good job of proving that at some point after her murder, Mr. Gerhardt got involved. And I told you this in opening statement. Clearly, there is some blood in Mr. Lyons' car. He's heard talking about it on text messages. Says he cleaned it up. Told Max he was going to do that. Offered some explanation for how it got there. But out of all of that, there has never been an admission by anyone for killing her. They haven't proven that. They certainly haven't proven that somebody premeditated killed her, made a plan to kill her. Even Keith said that when he lured her over there, he wasn't luring her over there to kill her. But when I tell you that we failed Demiah, it's not because of the fact that she had turned to some things that I think are unhealthy for any 14-year-old girl. It's not because she's not a human. She is a human. She deserves dignity. But she also deserves a jury that's going to find and kill her. That person hasn't been put on trial here today at all. I ask that you find Mr. Gerhardt not guilty in count 1 of the indictment and guilty of tampering with evidence in count 2 of the indictment. He clearly did that. You heard testimony about that. But when you're deliberating back there, think about what proof there is that he actually killed her. Think about that. Not about what Mr. Thomas said or what Miss Barsha said, but what the actual proof is. Think about that unidentified DNA. Think about skipping ahead because we don't have any data about what happened. I ask that you find him not guilty. Thank you.